Hey everyone, welcome to today's lectures in POLI 205, Intro to International Relations. So there's two parts today. There's Rationalist Theories, and then there'll be a separate video and slides on neoliberal institutionalism. So let's get started on rationalism. So in some ways, rationalism's a little bit different from what we've been looking at because it's both kind of a theory to a certain extent in of itself, but it's also kind of a methodological approach for how to look at social phenomenon. And so we'll go through the slide and then we'll unpack a little bit how it relates to things that we've looked at so far and we'll be looking at later. So it's a methodological approach that explains both individual and collective social outcomes in terms of individual goal seeking under constraints. So whether it's a person acting alone, facing certain constraints from the environment, making their decisions, or a collective, so people making joint decisions or making decisions in an environment where they're constraining each other, right? So when we talked about prisoner's dilemma, that was an interdependent situation where the outcome depended on what another one did. So those were constraints placed by the structure of the game. And so that was kind of, they're seeking kind of a social outcome or a joint outcome because neither determined the outcome by themselves. So it seeks to explain these outcomes in terms of individual goal seeking under constraint. So everyone, according to rationalism, is seeking particular goals and they're facing certain constraints in terms of making those goals. So it could be limitations um, in terms of capabilities to be able to get it. It could be in terms of interdependent, so it depends on what other people do in terms of what the outcomes are, but everyone is goal seeking. The focus on goal seeking presumes that explanations should proceed in terms of the relevant actors, the goals they seek, and their ability to achieve them, right? So who are the people who are participating in any particular decision, who will be affecting any particular decision? What are their goals? So what are their preferences in this particular situation? And what is their ability uniquely or in combination to be able to achieve their goals? The approach also requires some specification of constraints, which may be technological, institutional, or arise from interdependence among actors' choice, right? So we have to set what are the rules of the game? What are the different capabilities of the different actors? How are they interacting with each other? And what is their ability to control the environment? Are they all controlling, or are they subject to constraints based on their own limitations or on this being, say, an interdependent situation? Within beyond this, rational choice is remarkably open to alternative specifications. Notably, the goals are not restricted to self-regarding or material interest, right? So in terms of being open to multiple specifications, really neorealism and liberalism, which we've already looked at, and neoliberal institutionalism, which we'll be looking at later, are applying to a large extent rationalist theories. So they're all assuming that, remember, all of them were assuming that individuals or states, depending on the theory, were making choices as rational actors, right? They're goal seeking and they're seeking to make decisions to maximize their achievement of their goals. And so all of these different theories, despite assuming different goals, right? Neorealism was assuming that states are security seeking, and then liberalism said that individuals could be seeking any number of different goals. So they have very different goals in mind for them, but they were assuming that they were that they were rational. And neoliberal institutionalism similarly will be a theory that assumes that individuals are rational actors. So all of these have different goals that are specified for people, but all of them are kind of using the same approach of how humans make decisions. So it's all based on the rational choice mechanism or methodological approach to making decisions. Now, the set of goals that individuals or states can be pursuing is far wider than even the theories we've looked at have assumed. So most of them, for example, have still been saying that actors are self-interested. Liberalism could be a little bit relaxed here, but even typically liberal theories assume that individuals are pursuing their own individual self-interest. and typically across most of these theories, again, liberalism being a little bit relaxed here, but even here, liberalism uh, and neorealism and neoliberal institutionalism, typically the goals you're pursuing are material. So it could be economic, it could be security, whatever it may be, but they're material in nature. So we refer to pursuing the goals in terms of increased weaponry, or which is material, or increased money, which is material, things that we can count and touch. So but technically, according to rationalism, this isn't a necessary feature, right? It doesn't say that people can't have as their ultimate goal to be helping other people, right? Other oriented. It's not to say that their ultimate goals, or the goals that they're seeking at any time, have to be material. It could be ideational, pursuit of some form of happiness that's non-material, or inclusion, or whatever it may be. These the goals that you're technically seeking according to this type of model of goal-seeking behavior under constraints. These goals can take any form. So self-interested or other interested, material or ideational, it doesn't really matter. Most of the theories we look at in IR are going to assume self-interested material, but that's not a necessary feature of rationalism. What also complicates rationalism is that so many of the theories that we see take kind of this rational baseline, and then they add additional assumptions in, right? So they add in assumptions about, for example, neorealism adds in assumptions um, about the interests that we'll be pursuing. And then liberalism has certain additional assumptions that they'll place in terms of how the preferences are derived. And neoliberal institutionalism will have a similar approach. There's other theory, and then they'll work, if you're a neo-realist, you'll work probably your entire career, or a good part of your career, pursuing those wider set of assumptions. So you're going to be neo-realist, and you're going to be pursuing rational actors with a certain set of goals. And if you're liberal, you're going to be pursuing, rational actors and looking at how their goals are formed. And then if you're neoliberal institutionalist, you're going to be looking at, goal-oriented behavior within kind of the confines of that theories. There's others who take rationalism. It's still kind of an approach, but it becomes their theory in and of itself, in that they're not tied to any additional assumptions, right? They just want to see how people explain decisions from a rational perspective under constraint. So you put any individual or any group into a particular situation, and all they care about is explaining how can we explain this based from a rational choice perspective of decisions, goal-seeking behavior under constraints. And so they're not tied to any of these additional assumptions. Depending on the situation, they'll look at what are the preferences in this case. They'll look at who are the actors involved, what are the institutions involved, all of this, and they'll bring it in kind of ad hoc depending on the particular situation. So they're only really tied to rationalism or rational choice theory as kind of more of a little bit of their kind of theoretical approach, even though it's not this unified or more narrow theory that we would see with neorealism, liberalism, or neoliberal institutionalism. And so we're going to look at here just a little bit of the kind of the rational choice approach, if it's how it could be applied with additional assumptions in other theories, but also then one that is just rational choice through and through. It doesn't bring in any of the additional assumptions that these other theories bring in. So one of the most prominent rational choice or rationalist theories is referred to as expected utility theory. And so we're going to go through an example and go through how expected utility theory works using this example. And expected utility theory is important because it's something that we're going to return to when we get also to psychological theories later on. So we're going to operate under the context of this choice. So you've got a choice between two possible situations. So you're asked to choose between either a sure thing where I'll just give you $45, or you're asked to choose between a kind of a lottery or a gamble, where you have a 50% chance of winning $100 and a 50% chance of winning $0. So you've got either this sure thing, we'll give you it, or you've got this choice for this gamble. So before we go further, just kind of think about which you'd prefer in this situation. What would you take if I actually offered this to you in real life? And there's no right or wrong answer here, right? This comes down to individual preference. There's no right or wrong answer here, but think about what you would do. And so according to expected utility theory, we have self-interested pursuit of gain by national leaders on their own behalf and on behalf of their nations. So it's kind of what expected utility theory um, uh, expects. And so there's certain rules that are expected for how people make decisions. So first, preferences are ordered, right? So this means that, if I prefer, preferences for different outcomes are ordered, right? So if say there's 3 possible outcomes, we would assign each of them an order. I prefer apples to oranges to bananas, right? There's an order. Second, preferences are transitive, right? So this simply means that if I prefer A to B and I prefer B to C, then I also prefer A to C, right? So if I prefer apples to oranges and oranges to bananas, I also prefer apples to bananas, right? I don't have this weird, I prefer apples to oranges, oranges to bananas, and bananas to apples type kind of circular thing, right? I suppose somebody could have that, but that would violate expected utility theory. It's not something that the model could handle. Each different alternative has a utility. Utility is just kind of some measurement of happiness or good associated with it, right? So it could take on any form. So utility could be in terms of money, it could be in terms of happiness, it could be in terms of weapons, it could be in terms of time vacation, it could be in terms of grades, whatever it is in that particular situation. Most of the time when we're looking at it, it turns out to be money in terms of how we do it, both in terms of how we do examples, but also in terms of real life, how it seems to be applied. Oftentimes it's in terms of money, but it really could be in terms of any good. For each alternative, decision makers multiply the probability of achieving each outcome by the utility of the outcome, right? So each different alternative that you have, right? So this bears in mind when we're looking at rational decisions, right? That not only does each outcome have potential good, right? But there's also only a certain possibility that we get it, and we have to take that possibility into account. So for example, should you spend all of your money on lottery tickets? Well, if we just look at its utility, well, the utility of winning the lottery is pretty darn fantastic, right? Like that's a lot of money. But so why don't we all go spend all of our money on it? Well, we have to take into account the probability as well, right? It's a very, 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 very low chance of winning. So there's a tiny, tiny, tiny chance of getting a fantastic thing, but a large chance that you just, threw $1 or $2 or $5 or $20 down the drain. And that's the far more likely one. So when we want to weigh different alternatives, what we do is we multiply the probability by the outcome. So we find out what is the expected utility. So if you did this, 100 times, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, what would be the average outcome that you would get if you did it multiple times? Now, one time, any individual time you do it, obviously you're going to get either, like if you play the lottery, you're either going to win it or you lose it. You're not going to get like $0.001 utility or $1 utility or whatever it would be for actually playing the lottery, right? That's not what you're going to get in the individual time. But if you play the across multiple times, right, you might lose 10,000 times and then win the 10,001th time, or you might lose 5 million times and then win the 5 million in first time, right? So if you average out so those 5 million times you'd get 0, and that 5 million in first time you'd get 5 million, and you average all of those out. And that then becomes your expected utility, the expected if you played it multiple times for that particular alternative, that particular option, that particular outcome. And then decision makers select the strategy that maximizes the expected utility, right? So we would choose the outcome that gives us, on average, the best outcome, because that's what we expect to get based on selecting that option. Now, this isn't to say, and there's some disagreement sometimes between rationalists in terms of how much they believe this or not, but most rationalists would admit that like decision makers don't actually perform all these calculations in their head. They're not like mini calculators just being like, okay, well, the probability of winning lottery is X, and the the reward of winning the lottery is Y, and we multiply those, and then we make our decisions based on that. Instead, rationalists will typically say that decision makers make decisions as if they had done this, right? Like their brain does some form of calculation. It's not the exact calculations, right? But the decisions resemble those that you make if you would have done those calculations. So let's return to our gamble and see how we would be looking at this from an expected utility perspective. So again, we've got a 50% chance of $100 and a 50% chance of 0, or the short thing of 45. So first, let's look at outcomes are ordered, right? So there's 3 possible outcomes here, right? So there's the short thing of the 45, and then there's the gamble. We could win the 100, or we could get the nothing. We could win the nothing, or lose the nothing. And so we could say, okay, so there's 3 possible outcomes. And then in terms of the notation that we have, so we're going to call outcome 1, which is $100. We're going to call that outcome 1, we're going to call O1. And then outcome 2, which is a 0, we're going to call that O2, just for shorthand. And then outcome 3, for shorthand, we're going to call O3, right? And then we're going to call utility U, right? And so we're going to say the utility of outcome 1, which is $100, right? Is greater, than the utility of outcome 3, which is 45, and then which is greater than the utility of outcome 2, which is 0, right? So all of these have, so we've already seen all of these have, outcomes have utilities, and the preferences for them are ordered, right? We prefer 1 to 3 to 2. They're also transitive, right? We prefer 1 to 45, or sorry, we prefer 100 to 45. We prefer 45 to 0. And we prefer 100 to 0. And some of you may differ here, but I'm guessing that 99% of you are going to agree with that preference ordering. So how do we make the choice between the sure thing and the gamble? Well, we take the probability of the, we take the probability of the outcome, right? And for each of the different outcomes, and we multiply it by the utility, right? So when we want to be looking at the sure thing, right? So the sure thing was the probability of times the utility of outcome 3, right? And so hang on, I'm just going to turn on annotations just to make this a little bit easier to point to. I think that'll make it better for us. All right, so here we've got the sure thing, right? And so we're saying here, just kind of what all of this is saying, and you're never going to have to write one of these on a test, don't worry. You're going to have to kind of understand the logic of expected utility theory, but I'm never going to ask you to write out one of these formulas or do calculations on it. So if this type of writing is just like a foreign language to you, don't worry too much about that. This is just the shorthand that is used in it, and it's useful for saving space. And if you're comfortable with this type of expression, it's actually often quicker to understand. But if you're not, just listen to the words I'm saying in the explanation, and you should be okay with that. So essentially what we're saying here is that you're going to choose the gamble if the expected utility of the gamble is better than the expected utility of the sure thing, and you'll choose the sure thing, or you'll choose the sure thing if the expected utility of the gamble is less than the expected utility of the sure thing, right? Because remember, outcome 3 was the sure thing. So if we want to know what the expected utility for the sure thing is, we take the probability and we multiply it by the expected utility, or by the utility, and then we get the expected utility, right? So let's calculate that first. So the probability in a sure thing is 100%. And in terms of when we're writing that as a probability, we say that's a probability of 1. And then the outcome is 45. The utility for that outcome is 45. So in this case, we would have 45 is the expected utility of the sure thing. And in this case, expected utility, and because it's a sure thing, utility would also be the same thing. You'd always get it. Now for the gamble, right, there's two different things, right? There's two possible outcomes, and so we have to add them together, right? You could get one or the other. So you've got a probability of 0.5, right? That so probability. Let's start with probability for outcome 1, right? So you've got a 0.5 probability that you get $100, right? So probability 0.5, and then utility for outcome 1 is 100, right? And then you've got, so here then we're moving over to outcome 2, which is you get nothing. So here we've got the probability for outcome 2, and we're multiplying it by the utility for outcome 2. And so the probability is 0.5, and the outcome, or the utility for the outcome, is 0. Now, why do we write 1 minus p? Well, probabilities always have to sum to 100. If you're talking about a gamble, right, you either win something or like you can't have like a 70%, 5% chance of winning $100, a 25% chance of winning nothing, and then you stop, right? There can't be a 75% like just that's left blank, where we don't know what's going to happen or nothing's going to happen. If nothing's going to happen, then you get 0, so it's 50% chance, right? When we're listing for a gamble or we're missing gamble, there always has to, all the different outcomes have to sum up to 1, right? There has to be all possibilities, all situations, all possible outcomes have to be accounted for, right? And so it's simply, if you have 2 outcomes, right, and you want to know what the probability of the second one is, right, you take 100% and you minus the probability of the first one and you get the probability of the second one, right? So if there's a 70% chance of something happening, there's a 30% chance of the other thing happening. And how do we know? Well, 100 minus 70 is 30. I mean, we could have just wrote P1 and P2 and that would have been fine. But just always to make sure that you don't get yourself in trouble in terms of your percentages, we often will write 1 minus P. Not a big deal. So in this case, we've got a 0.5 chance of winning 100, 0.5 chance of winning 0, and that sums up to 50. So in this case, 50 is greater than 45. And so in this case, from a strictly expected utility perspective, taking 50 is greater than 45. Now, it's not that simple. Even in expected utility terms, some people are going to take 45, and that's completely rational. So I said there's not a wrong answer here. There are risk preferences that come into play when we're making our decisions. So some people will be what are called risk averse, and they just don't like gambles, right? They just prefer a sure thing over a gamble, right? And the risk aversion will determine how much they'll prefer the sure thing, right? So here they're only losing $5. So maybe, you know, a lot of you in this case probably said, sure, $45 or maybe 1 in 2 chance of getting $100. But 1 in 2 chance of getting nothing. I'm going to take the 45. But then what if it went to 40, right? Then maybe some more of you said, I'm going to take a chance on the gamble. What if this went to 35? Probably more of you would have then chosen the gamble. 30, 25, so on and so forth. And the smaller this gets, the more people are going to be like, I like the gamble, right? Those few people who are still hanging on are those who are more and more risk averse, right? The lower this gets, if you're still choosing this, the more risk averse you are. Conversely, there's some people who this sure thing could actually be higher than the gamble, and they'll choose the gamble, but they just love gambling. They get value out of gambling. And so they're risk loving, right? So the sure thing would have to be bigger and bigger to get them this. And then so we would measure someone more, the bigger this gets, if they're still choosing the gamble, the more risk loving they are. And then there's people who are risk neutral. So a risk neutral person is someone who, imagine this, we replace the 45 here with 50. Right? So this one was 100% chance of getting 50. This was 50% chance of getting 100, 50% chance of getting 0, expected utility of 50. A risk-neutral person would be completely indifferent between these two choices. They'd have zero preference between the two. Someone who is risk-averse would take the sure thing, and somebody who's risk-loving would take the gamble. But somebody who's risk-neutral would be completely indifferent. We're not going to go too much into that in this course. That starts getting more complicated. So, so it's not to say that but I just wanted to point out, it's not to say that someone who makes this choice is wrong. The big thing to remember here, because we will talk about it a little bit when we talk about psychology, the big thing to remember here is that what's important is consistency, right? If you're risk averse, you're risk averse, right? So for example, if I give you this choice, you don't one time take this and then the next time you take this, and then the next time you take this, and then maybe 2 times you take this, right? You don't go switch from being risk averse to risk loving to risk reverse. You're consistent in that. So if you take the 45, you always take the 45. If you take the gamble, you always take the gamble. You don't switch back. And so we will return to that when we talk to psychology. But for now, that's not too important. So turning to IR, consider a choice to go to war. A state would choose war if the expected utility of war, which is always a gamble, is greater than the expected utility of all non-war options, right? War is a gamble. Even the strongest state doesn't know what the outcome is going to be, right? You have a certain probability of winning. You have a certain probability of losing. You probably have a certain probability of other different outcomes, right? A decisive win, a limited win, a stalemate, a small loss, a big loss. You've got all these different probabilities. There's different utilities for each of these different outcomes. So war is a gamble. And so from this perspective, we would expect states to choose war, the gamble, if it has a greater expected utility than all the non-war options. So now we're going to turn to a different theory for rational choice. And this was a theory that came out in the mid-1990s, and it got a lot of attention for rationalism. And it's, I typically work in political psychology, so rationalism kind of oftentimes kind of is at the other end of the spectrum, because in psychology, we're saying people aren't generally acting rationally. But I've got a lot of respect for the elegance of the study that we're going to be talking about in the kind of the research program that was born out of it, because it recognizes something that almost nobody working in IR and even a lot of commentators in journalism or in diplomacy or in government realized, even though it's so almost stupidly obvious. It's sad it took us to the 1990s as maybe society to figure this out, but it's actually really important. So imagine a situation where A and B are in conflict over a division of $100. It'd be a lot more, but again, let's stick with our easy math. So in a fight, if this went to war, A is a 50% chance of winning and B is a 50% chance of winning, right? So both states are roughly equal in power. So if they fought each other, it could go either way. We have no idea how it's going to go. It's a toss-up. So what's the expected utility of fighting, right? So we would need to know. So we've got the chance of probability of winning, right? But we would need to know what is the utility of winning and what is the utility of losing, and then we could calculate it, right? And then we could figure out what's the utility for fighting. And are there any offers that are preferred to war by both A and B? Is there a way that we can avoid war in this situation? So in this case, we'd probably be saying that, because it's fighting over $100, you got a 50% chance of winning 100, you've got a 50% chance of winning 0. So is there a way that we could split up this $100 that makes both of them happy, right? You could say maybe 50-50 and hope that they're risk averse. Because we say a sure thing of 50-50 or the probability of war. If they're risk averse, that might work. If they're risk neutral, it might work. They're indifferent between the war and the other, so that might work. If they're at all risk loving, then that won't work. But you would need that, find that very, very small margin. It's really one offer period out of all the possible divisions. There's one thing that's mutually acceptable to both. A would accept anything where A gets 50+%. B would accept anything where B gets 50+%, and the only places where these overlap is 50-50. And again, that's not strongly prefers. That's kind of at the indifference between the two. So we're talking about very difficult negotiations here to find that what we would call in negotiations very small bargaining space, a space where both sides could potentially be happy with an agreement. So what Fearon brought in, so this research was started by James Fearon, brought in as a concept, and again, it should be obvious, but war is costly. So most studies that looked at war assume that war is the desired choice of leaders. They view the costs as being outweighed by the benefits, right? So someone has chosen war because they did the calculations, they did the expected utility calculation, and war is the best option for them based on those calculations. So even rationalist theorists assume that war occurs when no negotiated settlement exists that both sides would prefer to the gamble of military conflict, right? So they look at what are the, what's the expected utility of a negotiated settlement? What's the expected utility of just not doing anything? What's the expected utility of war? And the expected utility of war is higher than the others. But Fearon pointed out that as long as both sides suffer some cost for fighting, then war is always inefficient ex post, meaning after the fact. Both sides would have been better off if they could have achieved the same final resolution without suffering the costs or by paying lower costs, right? So at the end of the day, after fighting a war, there's a certain division. Somebody wins, somebody loses, a certain division of whatever they're fighting over. Maybe somebody got 100%, maybe somebody got 70%, maybe somebody got 60%, whatever the end results are, or whatever result is. There's certain costs that are associated with it that aren't factored in. So no matter what the divisions are, if you go to war, you pay costs of war. And so when we think about what are the costs or what are the outcomes of war, we have to take into account, so say you won the war and you got 100% of the territory. Well, you didn't really get plus 100, right? Because you also paid cost of war. You lost material, you lost people, you lost resources, stuff like that. So yes, you got plus 100 in whatever you're fighting over territory division, say, but you lost several $billion of money. And that side that lost, they didn't just get zero, right? They lost all the territory. They also got zero and paid the cost of war. So after the fact, they would have been better off, both sides would have been better off. The losing side would have been better off just taking nothing, because at least they got nothing after the war, but plus they paid the cost. And the winning side would be better off just getting the 100% of the territory without paying the cost of war. And so this raises an important question then. What prevents states in a dispute from reaching an ex-ante agreement, so a before the war agreement that avoids the cost of war they know will be paid ex post if they go to war? So why not just figure out in advance who's likely to win? Everybody puts their cards on the table in terms of what their capabilities are and says, okay, these are my capabilities, these are my strategies, this is how the war is going to go. They come to an agreement on the war, how the war is going to go. They divide up the territory based on that, or they divide up the resources based on that. And everybody is actually better off because they avoided paying those costs. And those costs of war can sometimes be very significant. So this would be, from a rational perspective, this would be better for everyone. So that raises the question, why does war ever happen, right? War is, from this would suggest, always inefficient, right? If we just came together, everybody was honest about their capabilities, we would know who's going to win before it happened, then we could avoid the war and we'd come up with the same outcome and everybody's better off. That makes a lot of sense. So why does it happen? Why are we still fighting? So what are the existing explanations for war, right? So you've got the anarchy explanation, which is typical. So we talked about anarchy and neorealism. So lack of central authority, um, kind of leads to a situation where, you have to look out for yourself. You're in a self-help environment, have to pursue competitive policies, and then so war can stem from that, right? But lack of central authority doesn't prevent negotiating agreements. There's nothing to say just because there's no central authority, you can't negotiate an agreement that is beneficial to both, right? As long as there's a bargaining space and there's something that everybody will prefer to fighting in war, anarchy by itself isn't enough to prevent negotiating agreements. One of the arguments you see often is preventive war. So anticipated shifts in the balance of power. So one side is declining, the other side is rising. The declining side, before it gets passed by the rising side, will initiate a war to try to stop itself from being passed, right? So US is declining, China is rising. According to this kind of preventive war type logic, before China passes the United States, the US may initiate a war to try to stop China from passing it. Or China kind of it's almost on par with the US and it's kind of getting frustrated with the US trying to still control things and will start a war. But typically in this case, it would be the US, right? So this is a typical explanation for war. It's a common one. But again, it doesn't say why we couldn't prevent or why we couldn't have negotiated agreements. Again, if everybody knows what the power is, everybody knows how the war is going to turn out, then why not negotiate the agreement based on how it's going to turn out and everybody saves the cost of war? Then finally, you have many rationalist theorists who point to the positive expected utility of war. So states fight if expected benefits of war are greater than expected costs. But why would you prefer a costly gamble to any war settlement when the war settlements that have the exact same outcome of the war or division of the resource that's being fought over, but avoid the cost of war is always superior to having that same division of the resources, but paying cost of war, right? Going to war is always, always, always has a lower expected utility than the same division of resources with without the cost. So positive expected utility then doesn't say why we don't reach that agreement, because that agreement is always superior. So how do we find a bargaining space, right? How do costs of war make it easier to find a bargaining space, to find a settlement without fighting? So imagine the cost of war $20 for both sides, right? So remember, we're fighting over $100 again, right? And the cost of war, if you go to war, you're going to be paying $20 in costs. So are there any proposed divisions of the $100 that both A and B would prefer to war? So let's think about what the expected utility for both sides are, right? So let's imagine the two outcomes. So there's many possible outcomes to a war, but let's simplify it and say there's two possible outcomes. You either win everything or you lose everything. So you either get the 100 or you get 0 if you go to war, right? So the expected utility for war is 0.5 times 100, right? 50% chance of winning, because remember they're equal in power, and 50% chance of getting 0. But then we have to subtract the $20 in the sure thing of $20 for the cost of war, right? So A's expected utility for going to war is 30. And then B's expected utility, because it's symmetrical, both have the same power and both have the same possible outcomes, is also 30. And so this means that A will prefer anything where they get more than $30, and B will prefer anything where they get more than $30, right? Because that's better than what they're getting from war. And so is there somewhere where that overlaps, right? Well, that means that there's a bargaining space from, let's put it in terms of A, right? There's a bargaining, but it's the same for both. There's a bargaining space between $31 and $69 where both sides do better than expected utility of war, right? So from the A prefers everything where they get more than $31, right? So they like everything 31 to 100. B likes everything where they get more than 31. So when they get 31 to 100. And if we translate that into A, B likes everything where A gets 69 or less, right? And so A likes everything where they get 31 or more. Where do those overlap? Well, they overlap from 31 to 69, right? That is something where anything from 31 to 69 is something where both of them are doing better than what they're expected to do from war. So remember when we talked about it before, right? How do you find the bargaining space if we don't take cost of war into account, right? We said, well, with the 50-50 odds of winning, right? There was the expected utility of war was 50. And so the only negotiation, the only settlement that you could reach was an even split. And even then, that would only be preferred if they were risk averse. They'd be indifferent between both options if they're risk neutral, and it would be suboptimal. It still would never be accepted. There'd be no acceptable option if at least one of them is risk loving. So that's a very small bargaining space. Here, all of a sudden, we've got a pretty big bargaining space. We've got a bargaining space of almost 40 out of 100 that is mutually acceptable to both. Now, there'll still be some conflict over where do you end up in the 31 to 69. There could be still some division over that, but that's a much easier bargaining space to find a settlement in. So it should make avoiding war more easy. So then why does war occur, right? And there's three possible reasons. So first, to be able to reach this agreement without fighting, it requires everybody to know what the probabilities of winning are. So you could find the bargaining space, right? You have to know what is the probability of winning so that you could figure out what range of outcomes would you accept, right? What range of outcomes is better than going to war and paying the costs, right? To know who's likely to win the war and what the likely division is going to be, then you need information about the strengths of the others, the strategies of the others, and whatnot. And because it saves the cost of war, most of the time, states should be fine to give it to the other, right? Because they do better off, right? It would be just better most of the time for states to know how strong you are, how strong the other is, what's the outcome of the war going to be, and then just avoid the cost of war and divide it up like that. So most of the time, this shouldn't be a problem. But sometimes your own strength, right, is based on surprise, right? The only way that you are as powerful as you are is because the other side doesn't know about your strategy or doesn't know about weapons that you have. And as soon as you tell them about this strategy, as soon as you tell them about these weapons, then you're actually much less powerful than you were before, right? So so you have an incentive to be lying to them because if they know the truth, you're actually much weaker and you're in a much worse off position than you were before. So in this case, because sometimes both sides or one side isn't telling a true story about how strong it is, it can be very difficult to find the bargaining range. Both may be misrepresenting, maybe saying that they're much stronger than they are. They may be saying different amounts. So one side is giving a proposal based on the information they have at hand that the other's not willing to accept. So it can make it difficult to find a suitable bargaining range. Second is what we call commitment problems. So commitment problems can exist if we're going to be reaching an agreement today, what stops somebody else from reversing it and trying to take the territory later, right? So for example, preventive war situation. So let's put country names on it. So the US is declining, China is rising, right? And so US is contemplating a war to stop China from rising it. Like if they could beat it now, the US could stay more powerful for a while, right? And so they're saying, okay, well, actually, this war is bad for both of us because look how costly this would be. Let's just make an agreement based on the probability of winning a war, and we'll just split things up like that. And, we're not necessarily going to be fully happy with this division, but it's better than getting this exact same division and paying the cost of war. The problem is that China is going to keep rising, right? And so China could come back 5 years later or 2 years later and say, we want to renegotiate, right? And now, when it gets to the renegotiation, the US is less powerful. And so China's in a better, it's got a higher probability of winning the war if there were to be one. So even if you went back to negotiating, even if you avoid the cost of war, China would be getting a better division of it. And there's no way at that time one, when they're meeting that first time, when the US had been contemplating starting the war, there's no way for China to say, I'm going to be more powerful in the future, and I promise not to use that power against you to revise this in 5 years. There's no way for China to promise that in a way that the US would believe. And so China can't commit itself to respecting the division that they're having. And because China can't commit itself, then the US can never be accepting of the decision, right? Whatever the bargain is, the US doesn't trust that China is going to respect it. And so the bargaining space goes away. The third possible reason why that Fearon examines why wars can still happen, right? Because war, according to him, is always irrational from the perspective of there's cost of war. Because we have war, if we're assuming people are rational, there's got to be other things. So sometimes it's because of private information, sometimes it's because of commitment problems. And then the third is indivisibility, right? So this means that, sometimes an issue that people are fighting about is indivisible. So bargaining space. So again, when we were talking about division of $100, right? And so we said based on kind of the scenario we laid out, anything from 31 to 69 was acceptable. What if it was $100 bill and you couldn't make change, right? You can't cut the $100 bill in the middle and give half of it to one and half to the other, because as soon as you cut it, it loses complete value, right? So it's either one side gets a $100 bill, and let's assume there's no change that you could give. Um, one side, so it means that either one side gets a $100 bill or the other side gets a $100 bill. There's no 50-50 split. Well, one side getting 100 and the other getting 0 isn't within the 31 to 69 bargaining range. So one side is not going to accept it. One side would actually prefer war with the risk of losing. War at 30 is better than getting 0. So that's the side getting 100, and one side's going to be getting 0. So one side's always going to be preferring war in that type of scenario. And unfortunately, there are scenarios in international politics where it turns out we are dealing with indivisibility. And these are some of the toughest ones to solve in international politics. These are the toughest conflicts. So some of the research, for example, on indivisibility looks at sacred religious spaces, right? And these are places that can't be split up. So normally land, we could say, okay, we could split this field and we can move the border a little bit, right? That's fine, right? But these sacred spaces, you can't draw like a dividing line in it. It's important to be kept intact. It can't be picked up and moved. It can't be split. It can't be carved up. It's either or. I have it or you have it. And we're not going to accept having like 20% of it, because you can't have 20%. It's not splittable. And so the territories that are viewed as just, we can't accept the division of it. It's so important to our sense of selves. These land territories are the most difficult to resolve in terms of conflict. And because there's no bargaining space over it, it's an all or nothing thing. Nobody's willing to accept, there's no middle ground, there's no bargaining space when it comes to these issues, oftentimes, or it's very difficult to find bargaining space on these issues, much more difficult than on other issues. So that's the third place where we would see, from this rationalist perspective, where war can occur. All All right, so that's all for this topic. So next, once you take a small break and then move over to the neoliberal institutionalism.